just do a sound check. Can you hear me if I don't use a mic?
Yeah.
It's just a little easier.
There are a few folks with some hearing problems.
Well, I actually have hearing. I didn't bring my hearing aids tonight, so if you have questions, you may need to wave. Let me just check again. This is the level at which I'll be speaking. Does that work for everybody? Otherwise, I'm glad to grab the mic. Okay. I'll watch for things if you will. The part of the reason I didn't bring books, just to make clear my role here, I'm always glad to be at an event that is community-minded, and I don't want to turn it into an opportunity to sell books. The reason I accepted to come here tonight is to share what I've been observing about fake news, to share my past as a journalist, to talk about having taught high school, to talk about social media, and I'm hoping that while I do, you interrupt me regularly. I mean, a group with the name Voices should feel free to interrupt me at any moment. But I'm thinking about this, I noticed a couple of things. Right after the horrible shootings in Florida, on YouTube was a video. And the video claimed that some of the eloquent students are what are called crisis actors, meaning they're not real students, that people are putting them on TV and they're trained to convey a certain point of view. That, of course, is a perfect example of video false news. And Facebook took it down. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a while about the danger of that remedy too, but there are some other sides to this. And then one of my favorites before the election was there was a Twitter feed that said that Michelle Obama had unfriended or disconnected herself from Hillary Clinton's Twitter feed. Now you can go quickly to Twitter and see if that was true, but that kept going around and around. The same group that posted this also created a story that fake news is a story being disseminated by mainstream media, or what disparagingly is being called legacy media. So it's an Alice in Wonderland world out there, because not only do we have fake news, but we have fake news about fake news being disseminated by legitimate news sources. And, you know, I laugh too, but there's a consequence that's coming up that is happening. One of the consequences is eroding trust in legitimate media. And there's a 2017 Gallup Knight Foundation survey on trust, media, and democracy, and it shows that most, meaning a majority of Americans now, believe it is harder to be well-informed and to determine which news is accurate. Now think about it, and we've never lived in a time in which we could get more information instantly. I mean, I was doing research for an article I have to write about the economics of book publishing, and in 10 minutes I had reliable statistics on falling units of sales, number of bookstores open. I mean, it only takes a click. Yet in this world, more and more people now are coming to believe that they don't know what they can believe and trust. Now, one of the points I like to make about fake news, and it may have to do with being of a certain age, and when you get to be my age, you'll appreciate this. It's been around for a long time. This is not a new concept. As a historian of journalism, I found lots of fake news in the 19th century. And one of the things that a lot of Americans don't understand is how unique our media is in the United States and the way it came about. So a quick 30-second lesson in what happened. In the 18th century, Civil War period, and those periods before, you would have not recognized newspapers. I mean, you particularly wouldn't have recognized what a newspaper was like, because they were virtually propaganda sheets supported by the different political parties. So in St. Louis, where I was researching the life of Joseph Pulitzer, who went on to become an important publisher, the two main papers there were called the Missouri Democrat and the Missouri Republican. They had no advertising. It was money from the political parties that sustained them. And also, when a political party took power, they then did all the state printing with that newspaper's presses. So you were rewarded by the election. Now, they did cover some news, but most of the news tend to be very slanted in their favor. One of the great pleasures I had was finding Joseph Pulitzer giving a political speech in one town, and one newspaper talked about his power of oration and how the large crowd was swayed by his words under the beautiful sunshine. The other paper spoke of the heavy rain and the free people had showed up to hear this important God. That's what it was like. But what happened in the 1870s and 1880s is people like Joseph Pulitzer and others discovered a way to break that and create what we now have, the mass modern medium. The way they did that is by creating a newspaper filled with stories that were riveting and compelling, city life, murders, mysteries, all that kind of stuff. There was also technological changes, just like today, that changed everything. Instead of having the internet, they had the Victorian internet, that was the telegraph, bringing news across the country fresh in the morning. So if Congress did something in the morning, the afternoon papers could have it. People were moving in from the farms and coming to the cities and becoming commuters needing entertainment. Selling a newspaper at the train station was important. But also underlying this was something else. The newspaper started carrying advertising. And advertising was a form of news, because for the women who had left the farms in this huge migration to the cities, they needed information that was vital to them. Where could they buy gingham? Where was the flour at the best price that they needed for their bread? And they got that through advertising in the newspapers. The same moment, national companies were coming into existence, Levi Jeans, Sears, etc., who needed to reach a national audience, so they began to buy advertisements. The point was that these new newspapers, this new generation of newspapers, discovered a formula that we've had until now, which was by providing objective, and we'll talk a little bit later about what objective means, but by providing real substantial news that everybody wanted. You could sell these newspapers by millions of copies sustained by advertising, and you could free yourself, wean yourself from political party support. So, starting in the late 19th century, we began to have newspapers, and the ones that were like that, the ones that still are in existence, are things like the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times. The New York Times was created in 1851, but it's still of that model. But during that period, just to give you some amusement about fake news, for instance, during the Spanish-American War, when William Randolph Hearst's newspaper went head-to-head with Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, The World in New York, they were making up stories right and left about what was going on in Cuba. It helped sell papers. Well, the Journal at one point published an article about a colonel named Philip Razunet who had died in the field of combat. Well, The World didn't have the story, so they picked it up, reworded a little bit, and ran with it. The next day, the Journal announced that if you studied the name of the colonel, you'd find it was an anagram for "We pilfer the news." So it gives you a sense of what was going on. Now, of course, in the 20th century, we had a lot of fake news, and one of which we used to love and buy and laugh. The National Enquirer and newspapers like that at the grocery store. I mean, they were so good, you didn't just read them at the stand. You sometimes bought them and read them aloud at home. And, I mean, I still can't believe that Eisenhower was born of aliens from Mars. But anyway, the point is they were rivetingly good. But we knew as a society that that was much like The Onion today, is a form of public sarcasm and humor, although, trust me, members of the House regularly get themselves in trouble by retweeting or passing one of the stories on The Onion published, not realizing it's fake. Campaigns have also used fake news. I mean, if you really studied the period of Watergate during Richard Nixon, it isn't just a matter of breaking into the Democratic headquarters. In New Hampshire, there was all kinds of fake news they purveyed. And this still goes on today. Local elections that aren't carefully monitored, somebody will put out a press release under some sort of weird stationery claiming that the other person was twice divorced in another state, and by the time it's checked out, the damage is done. And this is particularly true because I'm going to get to a concept called selective perception, which is growing in our country. So that's the background. Fake news is not new. We've lived with it, but we did have a number of social mechanisms to cope with it, like nobody seriously held up the National Enquirer and said, according to this study, we need to do these kinds of things. But the first major change that has brought fake news to our attention, why we're gathered tonight, is social media. Think of social media as a petri dish. In that, if I were at this meeting tonight and I said something like, I'm trying to think of something that won't get me in trouble, but let's say, Susana Martinez never registered to vote in New Mexico. There are, what, 50 of us in here, and some of you are thinking, well, that can't be true. I mean, somebody would have figured this out before. The damage is stopped. But if I do that on Facebook and have 400 friends, and only 4 of them that each have 400 friends pick up on this, Within a few hours, thousands of people have gotten this wrong information. And that's the problem with our instant ability to re-click, to retweet, to repost anything that is inaccurate in that sense. And I'll give you a few examples. Just recently, I saw on Facebook, put up by somebody who has a PhD, who I will not identify, a photograph, 2 photographs of Pat Robertson, accompanied by a photograph of Michelle Obama and a photograph of the current First Lady in lacking clothes. The first photograph showed Michelle Obama in a dress that revealed her arms, and the quote from Pat Robertson is how she was really out of line as a First Lady to be dressed this way. The second quote from him in reference to the naked picture of the First Lady was, and let me get it right, it was pure art that shows the beauty of God's work. Now, my gut instinct said, that can't be true. I mean, there are enough newspapers in this country to have covered that kind of comment 5 years ago, or 2 years ago, or a year ago, or whenever the pictures came out of Mrs. Trump. But yet, there it was. So I immediately went to Snopes and other places, which I'll tell you about if you don't know about, to confirm whether this was true. Found out it was a false story. And what's great about Snopes is it even tells you when it was first disseminated, so you can get something. Immediately posted it, and the person said, oh gee, I'm sorry. But I know by then that already several of their friends have reposted it. And I bet you tonight, if you do a search on Google for that, you will find hundreds, if not thousands, of Facebook postings keeping that alive. Another one that came about recently was that people started saying, quick, click here and tell me you're still my friend, because Facebook has this new assiduous logarithm that somehow prevents you from seeing my postings. Well, that was another one, but that kept being reposted and reposted. Now, that's not a big deal, and it's not assiduous, but the point is, people are doing this without thinking about it. So the first problem that's changed everything for us who is interested in politics and a sane political discourse isn't just the presence of fake media, it's this Petri dish-like condition in which you drop it into the social media and you can almost never stamp it out again. You know, it's like fighting a forest fire here, where every time you finally build a fire break, some cinders cross over and you go chasing after them. The second thing that's happened is that there are evil people in this world who have recognized the power of fake news. And I'm not going to get into whether there is this Russian collusion or all that, but you just have to read the indictments of the Russians, which, even though they won't be tried because they're Russian nationalists and all that, but it's a fairly convincing document that they were involved in spreading fake news throughout the United States. I'll leave it to others to determine what effect it had on the election and all of that. But you can find endless examples of these things. And again, they're depending on that Petri dish kind of condition. And their objective may simply be to disrupt. I mean, don't forget how much people who don't like the United States would like to disrupt things that are going on here. And our openness makes it very possible. So, you know, if you view the Russian thing as simply to get Trump elected, you could just simply discount that and find more and more evidence that there were folks interested in disrupting what our process of democracy. Motives vary a lot, but let's not forget that there's been an emergence in the last 10, 20 years of nationalism around the world, and it's infected everybody from our country, and it's closing its doors to the Russian sense of we were once a great international power and we must get there again, and to the emerging Chinese, who within 20 years hope to be the leading economy of the world and are at a military basis around the world just like we have. So the first is the social media. The second is folks actually using it. But another one that I think not everybody's been really cognizant of and that one that's having a really eroding effect on us and our ability to conduct our democratic business is the choice of certain people in power, and I can't come up with a better word, and it's an awkward word, to weaponize the concept of fake news. Because we have this growing problem in the United States, which is called selective perception. What that is that our ideological blindfolds for many Americans is so strong that you cannot present evidence to that person to prove their point of view wrong. Now, we have different points of view. I might be a liberal and I feel it's our moral obligation to feed people who don't have food. There's no evidence that I'm going to be able to prove that. But there is evidence within that context. For instance, one of the reasons Republicans have supported the Women and Infant and Children, the WIC program, for years is because when reasonable members of Congress used to exist, they would sit down and be presented with evidence that low birth weight children and children who don't get good nutrition early on end up being a bigger cost to society later in medical health. So that provided cover to conservatives to vote for what is considered a social program. Today, that same conversation can't exist because evidence-based arguments are diminishing in importance all the time. And it isn't just a matter of ideology. It's what it is that people have developed what political scientists call selective perception, in that they will only use and agree with facts, what you and I call facts that supports their viewpoint, and discount the others as being unreliable. And that is a real problem when you have fake news being around, because what leaders are discovering is that they have a cadre of people. Let's say 30% of the voting population support them. But that group of people who are supporting them are those who are particular victims of this selective perception, who will believe whatever is being told of them. So if their leader says, the Washington Post report, the New York Times report, is an example of fake news, they will dismiss it out of hand without ever having considered it. And that's going to be a growing problem with fake news, in that it is now being used like painting the entire side of the barn. CNN, look, this could turn around on Fox and others. The point is, by simply labeling anything that is not favorable to you fake news, is working within the United States. But even more horribly, and we forget this about the United States, we give out cues to the world. This is now taking off all over the world, and I bring you a few examples. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, in February, when confronted with an Amnesty International report. Now, Amnesty International falls into the camp of being a liberal group, and it's a lot of people's perspectives because it believes in human rights and all these things. But part of the reason they're powerful is they carefully document what they do. So if you get an Amnesty report, a national report, you will see their methodology, you will see their studies. They don't just put out a press release, it'll be a 50-page book with all the interviews they did. So anyway, they allege that up to 13,000 prisoners have been executed in his military prisons. His response? Fake news. In Myanmar, if you've been following what happens with I'm not sure I always pronounce it right, the Rohingya people, you know, the persecuted Muslim group, most of whom have left, the government is saying that it's fake news. There is no such thing as Rohingyas. And they use the term fake news. Venezuela President Nicolas Maduro said in July that fake news was the whole thing about his constitutional crisis, was all fake news from outsiders. So it isn't just our fight. It isn't just who's in power in the United States using fake news. It's endorsing other leaders who are much more totalitarian to use it as a line of defense. I mean, you've got to remember there were periods in our history, our world history, where a totalitarian regime wouldn't have killed somebody like Nelson Mandela. Yes, they put him in prison for 23 years. Why? Because the United States' wrath would have been down on them. And today, there's an invitation of this ability to dismiss counters against them as fake news is being mimicked all around the world. So what does that leave us with? What do we do about fake news? And I'm no expert, I'm not a scholar. My coming to you is A, my experience as a journalist, B, my experience with high school students, and C, being asked to be a resource. And when you're asked to be a resource, it's much like being a journalist on deadline. You study madly so you don't look completely like an idiot. And I think a lot of the answer lies in what I call media, or other people call media literacy. You know, one of the things most of us in this room have done fairly well in life, we have made our children economically literate. We expose them to checking accounts early, maybe create a savings account for them. And one of the things that separates poor folks from well-to-do people, or people who've been middle class in the United States, is they lack economic literacy. They're much more subject to going to rental furniture places and ending up paying a lot of money The same with other kinds of literacy. Well, media literacy is something that we're lacking, and I think one of the reasons we're lacking has been the huge change in the news media. 40 years ago, a city like Los Alamos, they would have called it penetration, or other ways of looking at it, but virtually every household in the morning would have had a newspaper on the front stoop. And every kid would have earned some money getting those newspapers on the front stoop, and if their aim was decent, hopefully on the front stoop. What that meant is that children were growing up in homes where they saw responsible adults engaged in reading the news. And some of them might well have shared the news, and those adults would have known things like bylines, who can be trusted. They would have known issues of bias. They would have understood what sourcing is and all those kinds of things. Our viewing of news now has become much more private. A lot of you are probably reading the Santa Fe New Mexican or something like that on your iPhone. There's less interaction with the world around you. And so the kids who are growing up are getting less of that kind of socialization. And by the way, I'm not speaking in disparaging ways about kids. There are a lot of things they're doing extraordinarily well about this. But as a result, and schools are not picking up the thing. So a lot of younger people, for instance, are not being equipped with the critical skills necessary. And I'm talking about skills, not the wisdom that you and I might have, but simply the skills to be able to parse the news media. A Stanford study that I was just looking at on my iPhone tonight did a number of really terrifying things. And they found that sponsored news was viewed by 80% of young people as being news. The word sponsored didn't mean anything to them on social media. Like a lot of people, when they look at a Google search and they don't recognize the first 3 or 4 entries, are being paid for to be put there. Those distinctions are not known. Then they went further and they showed, for instance, the kids a photograph of like a daisy or some sort of plant that had merged together, and the caption was, what happens to plants after a nuclear attack? And they all thought this was proof of mutation of plants because of a nuclear attack. And so what's lacking, and I find this all the time because I've worked with young people, is that they don't know what a source is. They don't know how news is created. They don't understand how one newspaper is different than another. And so one of the things we have to do is to try to reestablish those understandings so that they have a better sense of evaluating things. For instance, if you open up the paper tomorrow and start marking it up with a pen, one of the things you'll notice is that probably as many as 9 or 8 out of 10 events are not created by journalists, but are created by people in the world seeking news. So for instance, it could be tomorrow, the governor announces new plan. That is an item of news that's shaped by the actor, not by the newspaper writer. They didn't suddenly go out to create that story. Events, a fire up near Los Alamos, a car accident there. Most of the news is a reflection of either things that have happened or actors who want to have things happen inside the news for very good purposes, such as agenda setting. So for instance, in New Mexico, in Santa Fe, let's say a group working with food distribution discovers that more and more people are going hungry in Santa Fe. So if they put out a press release, they might get a story on page 3. But instead, they start working on reporters about this trend out there that more and more people are going hungry. And the editor of the paper says, this is an important story. I'm going to assign 5 reporters. We're going to have a week-long series about hunger in Santa Fe. The effect of that is what we call agenda setting, meaning now the public agenda in Santa Fe is we've got to do something about it. These kids out of Florida are doing exactly that. They're very savvy. They're using their youth, their tragedy to advance what they believe is a solution, and it's working in the sense that all the newspapers, all the media is covering it, and Congress is now being forced to consider a solution. That is a classic bit of agenda setting. So the news media is as much used by actors as the media shaping things, which is one of the misunderstandings a lot among young people who see the media as a collective amoeba that is pushing a particular thing out. It's quite the other way around. In a democracy, all the actors are turning to the media much like the water in which we swim and using it to advance their causes. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the way we play out our public policy in the United States. The other thing that's misunderstood a lot, and I even have these discussions with my own personal private children, about how news is reported. And this is something that occurs in my little private world. I write books. So one of the things I hope is that the book gets reviewed. So the Washington Post runs a nice review of it. I have friends, including my children, say, "Boy, was that a friend of yours who wrote the review?" And I say to their shocking horror, no, he would or she would be prohibited from writing a review of the book. When the Washington Post or the Santa Fe New Mexican asked me to write a review, one of the things I have to sign is a form saying, I don't know that person. I have no social contact with that person, because they believe in the impartiality of the news. So what a lot of younger people don't understand is that even if you find fault with the New York Times, the Albuquerque Journal, the Washington Post, whatever, the news coming out of it is an attempt at vetting the news upon some very deep-seated principles of journalism. One is journalistic ethics. You can't write about your friends, or if you do, there should be a disclaimer in there, and occasionally there is. You know, the person says, I have known this person for 10 years, or we go to play pool together, or something like that. But more importantly, what happens even with disseminated staffs, like the New Mexicans operating with half the staff it used to have, a reporter comes in with a story, it just doesn't appear in the paper. The reporter has to write the story, and then an editor challenges that reporter. You really think that person said that? Let's give him a call. Did you really say the governor is an SOB using those words? No, I didn't. I said she was shining above all. Well, that's an A, but anyway. The point is, that goes on. So you have some trust that what appears on the front of a normal legacy media, as it's called, is likely to be more dependable than a tweet from a demonstration by a reporter or even a participant. The other aspect of the democratization of news that we all herald in some ways is with anybody with one of these devices. In fact, one of us could be doing that right now. Some guy with a beard and follically challenged says the media is type, type, type. It goes out on Twitter. And that's fine. It's instantaneous. But the recipients are not taking it with the same kind of quality that they would have taken something produced 12 hours later. Speeding up news is the enemy of accuracy. And so one of the elements of media literacy is that if you see something really weird on Facebook, turn to the legacy media, the ancient media, the whatever, the crippled media, whatever they want to call it. And if they don't pick it up after a few days, it's not because they're censoring things, it's because it's likely it has no legs. It wasn't true to start with. Granted, that's a 48-hour answer, but you can develop the same thing. And the great advantage we have of being of a certain age, we may not be able to operate these devices with the same lightning speed as some of those, but we have wisdom. And it really comes to play. I can tell you almost every day in my class when I taught high school, some kid would come in and say, I'm writing a paper for you, Mr. Morris. Do you know that the person who posed for the Statue of Liberty was really a freed slave, and white people have been trying to keep this story down? I mean, it could be anything else. Do you know that we really never landed on the moon? I mean, this went on and on and on. And I simply said, And they said, how do you know? Did you look it up? And I said, you get a gut instinct after a while. Let's look it up together. And invariably the story would turn out not to be true. Wisdom only comes from this accumulation of experiences. And so if we permit younger people to use social media without participating ourselves in social media, it's much like having people drinking without adults around. I mean, think about it, and I'm not going to take a position about lowering or raising the drinking age, but one of the things that's clearly happened is that when in the old days, when you could drink at age 18, you might well do it in a bar with somebody who was older, who might say to you, hey, buddy, that's the 14th vodka you've had. But when you closet drinking, much like you closet social media, there is no wisdom to participate in that moment. There's no one at the table to say, hey, Dad, or hey, Mom, did you know that Michelle Obama was really born in Venezuela? Notice I picked on her as opposed to the former president, as we know was born in Kenya. It's not being mediated by the wisdom that we collectively have. And some of the other dangers that I just want to point out is we also can easily be fooled by the sophistication that we can put up on social media, in that we can find pictures of Hillary Clinton shaking hands with terrorists that look just like a real picture. You don't see any little scissor cutouts and things like that. And so one of the things we have to recognize is what we used to look for proof, like a photograph. Today, you need to really think, wait a second, if my gut instinct says this is wrong, let me check it out. So one of the great things, like you growing up around a press probably heard, is your editors used to tell you when you were 21 and walked into a newsroom to be critical, to question everything. And they would say, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. That same kind of approach needs to be inculcated in the users of social media, that just because it appears on Facebook, just because it has a photograph, just because it looks like it's been set into type, and just because 1.5 million people have liked it, doesn't make it true. And that, I think, is wherein lies the problem, and also lies our solution. You didn't interrupt me with questions, so I hope you're going to do so now. Yes?
You haven't addressed cable news, all the partisan cable news networks, and I would like to see your take on that.
There's obviously a difference between CNN and Fox. And I get to, I don't have cable anymore in my house, but not because I was against cable news, but we never watch TV anymore. We're like everybody else, we're switching to Netflix, things like that. But I get to watch both in the gym. And I'm fascinated that Fox is forced to report things that aren't necessarily favorable to its viewpoint. CNN, my gut instinct is CNN hasn't, because a lot of the negative news fits a lot of their predisposition. I think it's an example of where bias exists, political bias exists, but that doesn't mean the reporting is always flawed. Now, there's lots of times when Fox reporting is flawed, but keep in mind, CNN has had its shares of mistakes over it. And I think both of them, I'm almost defending Fox here, but both of them has to do with the nature of live reporting. You know, every 5 minutes they have to put breaking news, because that's what's going to catch us. And the breaking news could be man sneezes in Los Alamos. It doesn't matter. It's a sense of, and this goes way back, and I'll get back to your question, but when local news began to become increasingly important to television, because the ratings for the local newscast is what determined how much they could charge for advertising on Channel 7 and Channel 9. The local newses began to hire consultants, and there was basically 4 consultants in the country, and they all said the same thing. You have to start off your newscast with a sense of urgency, and crime is perfect at it. So think of those Albuquerque newscasts. Breaking news, 6 people shot in the Heights. We have the helicopter on its way. You know, it's boom, boom, boom. I mean, your heart is racing. I mean, you think the world's coming to an end. The problem with that is that the public began to think, in many circumstances, crime was going up, which was the real story, was crime was actually going down. But that misportrayal became so commonplace with news that the cable networks have picked up on it, not that they cover crime the same way, but they cover everything with this. I mean, that Wolf Blitzer guy, I can put my hands on the heart things in my gym and my heart starts going up simply because of the way he's talking about the breaking news that's coming up now. That's what they thrive on. I don't know if they're more error-prone than other things, because both in the last 6 months you could make a long list of Fox News' errors and CNN's reporting errors. Fox News certainly likes to rub it in to the opponents of their viewpoint. Their group sessions, like there's a group with 4 or 5, they kind of snidely put down the other group. But I don't think CNN is completely free of that. What I think is worse about both groups is that there's a sense of elevation of voice. that simply by yelling at the other person is how you conduct politics in America. And the more reasoned voices get drowned out in this cacophony. What you never get, and this I think is shared by both, when an expert is brought on, they rarely get to complete this sentence. Saturday Night Live did this terrific spoof in which they were asking an African-American figure to comment. And every time he got ready to comment, the white anchor kept saying things. And then he said at the end, "It's really great that you've had a chance to speak out." And the guy's just like this.
There's a great Cosby show on that same subject.
Yeah, and it's just the whole point is that it's a focus on delivery rather than content that the networks thrive on. And, you know, the entire newscast that you see on CNN would fill a third, maybe one page of a regular newspaper. And so that's where I find more of the fault. But we'd all turn to CNN when there's a plane crash, and Fox will do the same job of doing it. But when you wander into the ideological fights that are going on in the U.S., there's a clear difference between the two. Yes?
I think it's not only the news, it's these commentators who people think are giving them the news or the correct take on something, and don't question clear falsehoods, you know, that you hear on there.
But I think part of that is this, again, media literacy. I'm not sure people know what a commentator is as opposed to a news reporter. And that's blurred in part, and I fault Fox and CNN, except here on CNN. Some of the reporters now tend to use closing words in their reports that imply this is good or this is bad, which when I was in journalism, you couldn't have. Your editor would have just killed you. So I think it's part of it is the commentators have crossed that fuzzy line where the people watching them, and if you listen carefully, people say, "I saw on Fox today," or "I saw on CNN that this is happening," and what they're really saying is they're quoting a commentator. You know, I mean, like, for instance, the New York Times is petrified of this. You can tell reading that they're really worried about the future. One of the things they run every day is viewpoints from the right and left. On every topic, they have a little thing you can click and see what both sides are saying. That's not happening in other forms of media. The New York Times has its faults, but is really concerned about its believability today. So there were, yes, and then I'll give you.
Given that Ronald Reagan took away the fairness doctrine.
Oh, yeah.
How did that affect reporting? And is really the ultimate agenda to destroy democracy?
Well, two questions. The fairness doctrine, if you don't remember it, goes back to the 30s when the Federal Communications Acts were passed about radio airwaves. The idea that was the airwaves of the nation were like a national park. They belonged to all of us. So if you wanted to have a TV station or a radio station, you had to be licensed. And when I was at first a radio broadcaster in the 70s, I even had to have a license before I could speak. And the fairness doctrine required that the station do a number of things to make sure that its work in the community was fair. Less so about news, but more about programming. So we would have 5 or 6 hours on Sunday morning when no one was listening, and we'd be filled with public affairs programs. Coming up next, for an hour, we'll discuss the new sewage system in the Northeast Heights of Albuquerque, and we'll have 6 experts on it. That's how we fulfill the fairness doctrine. So the loss of it, I think, is more emblematic of a change than actually having changed broadcasting. But I think what your second question about destroying democracy is less true in the sense that they're out to destroy democracy. I think people in power are discovering that there are ways to bypass the mediators, meaning the news media, and get their message directly. This was Nixon's dream and others' dream, Reagan's dream too, to get your message directly to the people, unfiltered. And that's what the big changes have happened with the change in broadcasting and others. Somebody who now in position of power doesn't depend entirely on holding a press conference, doesn't have to even answer questions from the media anymore. No one seems to be upset that certain people won't ask questions because they can get their message out. That, I think, the Disappearance of Fairness Act is emblematic of that change, and they're more and more successful at doing it. And that, I think, is the brightening prospect for democracy. In the back with the blue shirt.
I think one of the aspects of the fairness doctrine that you had mentioned was that if you made a certain amount of time available to one candidate,
Correct.
you had to make an equal amount of time available to the other candidates. In
That's
the same
true.
ways.
I
think that's very disruptive.
It wasn't. Keep in mind that news wasn't.
I think getting rid of it is destructive.
The newscast itself wasn't subject to that because there were news decisions that the Federal Communications Decision let them make. But it was true that programming, if a candidate came on and had an hour of the Sunday morning program, the opposition needed to have it. And because of the file that you kept in the front of the office, if you had a complaint about your coverage, you could certainly come in and lodge it, endangering their licensing, and they would probably put you on more.
Yeah.
But because news reporting was considered something different, it isn't like when the Fairness Act ended that CBS News then decided no Republicans would ever appear on the evening news.
I had another question.
Yeah, and then this gentleman.
It's not related to this. I saw recently that there was a suggestion made, like you said, there's sponsored content on Facebook, on Google, on all of the other things, that instead of simply saying sponsored content, that it would be necessary to put up who paid for the way you have to do with print advertising in a campaign, paid for by friends of candidate Z and paid for by so-and-so.
It's one of many possible solutions that could be invoked. The question is, in a society where a number of people still smoke and they pick up a pack of cigarettes that say this is going to kill you, I think it would work, but I don't know how effective it would work if it's the only thing we do. It would. I think you're right. I think it would help. The ones I think you all need to worry about, because you're a group who cares about interchange, is the more draconian things where Facebook and others say, we're going to start barring certain things like searching for words and something like that. The point of view of the extreme right and extreme left will suddenly be wiped out, and we'll end up having only moderates who have access to the center. And as you know very well, change in our society doesn't come from the center. It usually comes from different ends of it. And I believe in free speech. But that solution would simply require reporting of your funding, and that might be very great. But the problem still exists that people don't right now even distinguish what sponsored stuff is. They do not understand that this means somebody paid to have it there. Well, so maybe your solution would be a good one.
At least if it said this was paid for by.
Right. Gentleman, yes.
It seems like the problem in the country is we've got two group things going, and they don't talk to each other. You talked about selective perception. It's even worse than that. You cannot talk to the other side.
Yes. And I think that, but I think, it's a chicken and egg thing. I think fake news and social media is making it, and the disintegration of dependable media and respect for media is making it hard for both sides to talk to each other. In 1973, I had the honor of being an intern on Capitol Hill. And I worked for a Republican member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And he sat down every day with Democrats to work out the War Powers Act, which was passed by both sides, the idea to limit the president's right to make war without checking with Congress. And part of the reason somebody like he endured is that if he went out and campaigned and said, I believe in compromise, the people in his district said, oh, that's a pretty good idea. Now, that word not only has become a bad word, but it's institutionalized. It's become the third rail of American politics. And part of the reason, and this is more the right side than the left side, although the left side's been doing it too, in many ways the most important decision-making election each year is the primaries, not the general elections. Particularly with the fact that the House is gerrymandered in such a way that whoever gets the Republican nod or whoever gets the Democratic nod in a particular district will win. So what's happened is that you can activate the small group of voters that will show up in a primary by being so pure to your views that no one will win a Republican primary going around saying, oh, I'd like to really sit down with the Democrats and compromise. No. To the very end, I am going to stop this from happening. And then once they're elected, they can use their media, the one that's bypassing the news media, to keep feeding proof back home that they're the only one of the 435 members of the House that's standing up against this totalitarian idea of taking guns away or limiting your right to swim or whatever it might be. But what really plays on that is that, are we divided because we're increasingly divided, or are we divided because the tools have amplified the divisive voices in our society? I tend to think it's that. I think I think actually, if you could get people to gather in Albuquerque, 10,000 people next week, who gun rights people and people who aren't gun rights, and put them face to face where they can't use social media and are simply having a conversation that's well facilitated by a mediation group, I think you would find that a lot of people in the end would leave the room with at least one agreement. That's what Senator Kennedy and Hatch did at one point. They talked to each other and said, look, we don't agree on anything. Do we agree on something? And they came up with several things. That today is like poisonous. Both of those people would have lost their jobs if they did that today. And part of the reason they lost their jobs is that the social media would have permitted that to be spread in such a way. I want to get you, but is no one over here asking a question, or am I missing? I'm sorry. Do you mind waiting just 1 second? I'd like to get you in. I'm a little loss of peripheral vision here. Or is this the? Oh, this is the right-wing group. We're not. Sorry. Please.
I just wanted to ask you if you think that Facebook is going to be redefined as a media company. What do you think the chances are that that will happen?
And do you think there would be implications if they did that?
And
Being regulated by the federal government? I think any kind of federal regulation, that kind of media, is as impossible as banning guns. And the reason being that one of the problems that the internet poses for the world, and the only people who have solved it are the Chinese, who have been really good at censoring it, is there is no there. Where is Facebook? There's they're building a huge server in Las Cruces, but are they based in Silicon Valley? I mean, if you were to serve a subpoena, you could find a corporate headquarters, but if you really wanted to go and shut down Facebook, what could you do? The same thing with regulation. It's the internet, even if now net neutrality is different, and I'll get to that, but it's very hard. It's not like the radio airwaves that you can control. So I don't think redefining it would make much of a difference. I think social pressure could make a difference more than governmental pressure. Net neutrality, if you remember this debate, is one that has commercial implications, and that has to do with the physicality of the internet and what whether your broadband can be squeezed or not. But it doesn't have to do with the same issue of calling Comcast. You call Comcast a media company because they've got pipes or fiber optics coming to your house. But Facebook, it just it's in the cloud in a sense, and that's going to always create a regulatory problem. Your question, and then I'll get back to this gentleman.
Our Voices group has been about listening to information and then thinking about where are the ways that we can move that into action. So I wanted to, you mentioned Snoop?
Yeah.
Ways for us to inform ourselves. You're a teacher and you're teaching this and ways we can, I think you've talked a lot about, or a little bit about ways we can work with our youth to understand media literacy. There's maybe not regulation that we can push for, try to find for Facebook. But what are the things in New Mexico? What are the legislative?
Well, the first thing is, I think the first thing is media literacy, and that's why a lot of the journalism groups, and that's why I was at that panel, are working on ways of developing tools for media literacy. When I was a kid, I was raised overseas in France, and France was deeply influenced by Algeria and other countries, so it wouldn't be a surprise that I was told an Arabic saying by my teacher. And I was what's called a bavardeur. I chatted nonstop, would shut up. And my teacher said to me, turn your tongue around your mouth 7 times before you speak. We should be teaching people to do that about social media. Don't press retweet, don't press post until you've thought about it or looked at it. And then the skills that go along with that are really easy, because the web now is filled with media literacy websites listing the dependability of snoops, how to Google something to find out. And it is really instantaneous. I mean, you can just open up a separate window. So I think teaching media literacy is an important concept. The one about regulating things is problematic, the legal solution if you decided to do something. But you could, the same way we're working on smoking, obesity, it could be in the interest of the state to include a media literacy course as part of all social studies, to have a campaign on buses that say if you saw it on the web, it may not be true, or the same way we do with New Mexico True. We are spending all this money convincing people this is a great state. Do we need to be convinced? Sorry, I know they do outside, but my point is that that's a campaign that's using public money and partnerships. And the same with Facebook. look at the pressure that people have put on corporations that are providing discounts to the NRA. Turning consumers into using consumers in a sense for ethical decisions. What are you buying and all that? We can do the same thing. Pressure can be put on Facebook to have, like you've suggested, you know, who paid for this? Click here to learn more about this posting. I mean, here's an example of something. If you see a picture up on Facebook or something like that, there are ways to see where that picture came from. You can right-click on it or reveal coding, etc. These are skills that we should develop, just like we told people to develop skills about how to, you don't drive on the left-hand side of the road, especially at night. There's no reason you couldn't. And citizens groups can do this in a non-partisan way. It doesn't make you a left-winger to be media literate. It makes you into an informed citizen.
Right.
And it may help restore civility in that. I mean, one of the things I've known in my own life, and I'm curious if you're going to nod at this, is I live with people who agree with me. I mean, if you look at the voting demographics of our neighborhoods, we're increasingly Democrats here, Republicans here, different ethnic groups here. It's a real drag. So, anyway, you had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering, and maybe you already answered this, but is there an effort in high schools to teach students how to do this? How to
Very little. There's a growing sentiment to doing it, but here's the problem, and I speak as a former teacher. There's a lot of resistance among teachers. This is a good thing, but what it is yet one more thing that's coming down the pike. You know, not only do I have to administer state tests, and my salary is going to be judged by how well the kids do on that state test. Now you want me to teach them how to read a paper?
And we're done.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't going to get into that, you know. But my point is that there also changes. I mean, look, the standardized-based movement began in 1984 and reached its peak about 10 years ago. Changing schools takes a long time. You can't suddenly, one legislative session, say we want to include media literacy. It'll take a long time. And then what is the curriculum going to be? And trust me, that will be a political fight. Because will one of the handouts include a photograph of Fox as an example of negative, you know, I mean, and that will offend those people. And then another one saying CNN, the most trusted news source, can you use that in a handout? You know. Yes, you've had a chance. This gentleman.
So will you comment on business incentives in news? Because 50 years ago, Walter Cronkite told you the way it was, and the news division didn't have to make money. It was seen as a prestigious organization.
Yeah, although 60 Minutes always made money.
And now they are profit centers, which basically turns news into entertainment units.
The question is about the business relationship in news, particularly in broadcast. This was actually true with the press as a whole. You're right, TV news was the oddity in the sense that TV networks maintained their news. They didn't always lose money, but it wasn't a profit center, 60 Minutes being an exception. But the real bias that the news media has always had is that it's a money-making enterprise. That's why Man Bites Dog gets on the front page of the paper, because they depend on the readers. So news was always shaped by that, and sometimes a really long, worthy report about some social problem didn't make the grade in print. That was certainly true with television news. Now that the television news has become a profit center and CNN and Fox are making money, it certainly influences it because they need viewers. So that is part of the reason why there's that drumbeat. I mean, if that Wolf Blitzer guy came on and said, okay, for the next hour we're going to talk quietly about the federal deficit and the debt and its implication and what bond rates will be, you know, and all those pulse rates in the gym would go down. They don't have a choice under that model. The only one who has a choice is PBS's NewsHour. And guess what? PBS's NewsHour is on the brink of financial collapse. They really cannot raise money. And you want another example of media literacy. There are little things that are said on the NewsHour that escapes most viewers who aren't paying attention, which is that this report was made possible in part with funding from the such and such foundation that gave us money to report on opiates or gave us money to do such and such. So even they are influenced by the chase for money. And this motto at the NewsHour used to be, we had the right to be dull. Well, right now they're they're, because of the fact that people don't want to watch this kind of long reporting, need that drumbeat, they're going out of extinction. They're going to be extinct in no time. So you're right that the money influence has been very corrosive with news. But by the way, Walter Cronkite didn't always say that's the way it is. Remember during the Iranian hostage crisis, today was day 364 of America being held hostage. That is a kind of influence, pervasive influence he had on the United States, because that was in the form of agenda setting. Jimmy Carter went to bed every night knowing that the leading news broadcaster had reminded the nation of how much trouble they were in. You had a question.
So I am concerned a lot of the time about travelism and fake news and how they seem to just be the left and the right hand, and how they're both aspects of that are.
I like your term tribalism, by the way. Yeah.
Are being driven by people with agendas, and they're creating fears, and they're using those fears to their advantage. So my optimism that we're going to come out of this is not very high at the moment. And I guess I'm wondering, do you imagine or fantasize, us having some sort of respected, neutral arbiter that could end up with some influence someday on saying which media are really playing by respectable rules and feeding you honest information in a careful way? Or is that just kind of too much to hope for?
My sense,
Could
this
you
is what
repeat
worries.
the question, please?
Yeah, the question is, could there be a kind of independent, trusted arbitrator that would rise up and help us sort this out? Would that be a good way of saying it? A kind of Walter Cronkite suddenly appearing and saying, listen, folks, kind of thing. I think the problem we face is the same in politics, is that the news media now thrives like piranhas in destroying everything because it works. It gains readers, people turn to Fox. The Donna Rice thing, if you want to be trivia pursuits with Gary Hart, seems so mild today in what they're out for, right? And it turns out that most of our leaders have really clay feet. They've been sleeping with the wrong people, they've been doing all kinds of stuff, which they used to do, by the way. I mean, some of our godlike figures of the past were like that. So the question is, can somebody emerge from this in a kind of cesspool of media? I'm mixing my metaphors, a cesspool filled with piranhas. and I'm not optimistic. What I'm optimistic about is less individuals rising up than something else. And I've really taken up so much of your time, so let me end on that, and then I'll be glad to answer questions privately. If you've ever had a chance to read Dave Garrow's book on Martin Luther King, the biography that won the Pulitzer Prize, one of the things that those of us who write biographies fear is it's so centered on the individual that people who read biographies think that FDR ended the Depression and won World War II from his wheelchair. That the civil rights movement was much like a kid in Julian Bond's class once said, blacks were oppressed, then along came Martin Luther King, and everything's been fine since. Dorothy Cotton, who worked for him, said one of the problems that we have in teaching about great people from the past is that younger people begin to wait for the next Messiah. We need somebody to come up and lead us in the right way. And the truth of the matter is the greatest changes in the United States, the civil rights movement and things like that, were made by everyday people who showed up in churches just like this and said, enough is enough, and we're going to take action. And the person who ends up being the leader is the one who's thrown to the front of the parade, not the person who led the parade. And that's where I place my hope in the future. And I think every day that I meet young people, like I haven't met any of these, but the young kids coming out of Florida who are saying enough is enough, is the kind of hope that would change the U.S., not somebody who's so perfect who rises up and says, I'll solve your problems. So thank you for your time. I hope you said